Hi there, this is Harry and welcome back to my English lessons. Today I'm going to look at some expressions that a lot of students find very confusing. So I'm going to give you some examples, so make sure you listen and watch to the end of the video. Okay, so we're going to look at the beginning, in the beginning, at the end, in the end. We're also going to look at last, finally, lastly, and then by the end. So I'll try and give you some examples on each of them as we go through it. Okay, so as I said, just watch it to the end because they can be confusing and I want to try and get you to understand exactly how we use them. Okay, so let's start with at the beginning.
Start at the beginning.
So we use this when we are at the beginning of something. For example, at the beginning of a book. So at the beginning of the book, there's a list of the chapters. At the beginning of the book, there are details of the author. And at the beginning of the book, there are a list of other books that he has possibly written. Okay? At the beginning of the match, there was a minute's silence because some footballer who used to play for the team died in the last few days, and the club want to respect and honour his passing and the time that he spent with the club. So all of that takes place at the beginning of the book and at the beginning of the football match. Okay? At the beginning of the lecture, when you go into your university course, the lecturer will introduce himself and give you a brief explanation, as I have done on this video, as to what it's all about. So when I started the video, I said, this is what we're going to talk about. So that was at the beginning of the video. Okay? So let's look at in the beginning next. So
the beginning.
In the beginning, and this means that something started out some way initially and then perhaps it changed. So let's say you go to learn a new language like German or Spanish, Italian, and in the beginning you found it difficult because you weren't used to that type of language. The grammar or whatever it was, pronunciation was difficult, but as the course went on it improved, or you became more confident. So in the beginning it was difficult and then it changed. Okay? So we can also say that in the beginning you weren't sure about a particular job. If you've changed jobs and when you started for the first few days you were a little bit unsure, you didn't really like it, you didn't know anybody there. So in the beginning it was difficult, but after a few weeks you said, well, I'm not so sure what I was so concerned about. I really enjoy it now. The people are good, I got to know them, I spent a bit of time with them in some social events. So in the beginning, yes, initially the job was difficult, you weren't quite so sure that you'd made the right decision, but after a few weeks you were very happy with it. Okay, the next expression then is
At the end.
at the end, and this is at the furthest part or the last part of something. So for example, at the end of the book they might give you a little insight into the next book that the author has written, or at the end of the book there's a detailed index or reference or bibliography that you can check out. Okay, so that's at the end. We also use at the end of the day. You know, at the end of the day I go to bed. At the end of the week is the weekend. At the end of the month you'll get paid. So the furthest part from when you start on the 1st of September and they say, well, you won't get paid until the end. So at the end of the month you'll get your payment. Okay? At the end of the match everybody went home, they had a shower and they went out for a meal. At the end, when something was over. And then finally in this section we'll look at
In the end.
in the end. Okay, so in the end means finally or at last. So in the end, despite all his reservations at the beginning of the job, in the end he made a great success of his career and went on from strength to strength. Okay, so in the end, finally or at last. So you're wondering how you're going to get home, you're not so sure about whether you'll take the bus because it's a little bit late, but the trains have stopped running, but in the end you called a taxi. You just wanted to be safe and secure and make sure you got home at a reasonable time. So in the end, that was your decision. In the end, your career turned out to be a great success. Okay, so we've looked at the beginning, in the beginning, at the end, and now just in the end. Okay, so what we want to look at now are the other expressions. At last, finally, lastly, and by the end. So let's take them one at a time. So the first one,
at last.
At last. And usually when people are using at last, there's a little bit of frustration, or there may be a little bit of impatience, or even some discomfort. Okay, so you're waiting around for your friend to arrive because you said you'd go to the cinema, and you're watching the clock, you're looking at your watch, you're looking at the window, and then there's a ring on the bell. Oh, at last he's here. Yeah. So when he comes up the stairs, you say, oh, at last. Yeah, I thought you weren't going to come. So there's that little bit of impatience, that little bit of frustration. So at last he arrived. So you can place it at the beginning of the sentence, or you can even put it at the end of the sentence. So at last he has arrived, or he has arrived at last. The meaning is exactly the same. Okay, so let's look at the word finally.
Finally?
This can appear in different places in your sentence. Usually you might say it at the beginning. Finally, I went home after a long day work. Yeah, so it's at the very beginning of the sentence. You can also place it in the middle of the sentence, but usually before the main verb. So I went home and finally went to bed. Okay, so I went home and finally went to bed. So it's in the middle of the sentence, but before the verb to go. All right, and it's very common to say it in a presentation. So if you're making a presentation at work and you come to the very last point you want to make, well, this is an ideal place to use it. And finally, I would like to wrap up with a few comments. Okay, so you thank people, or you welcome people, or you tell them what they can do at the end of the conference or the presentation. So finally, it remains for me to thank my guests for their wonderful speeches. Okay, so finally at the beginning of a sentence, sometimes in the middle of the sentence. If you use it in the middle of the sentence, it comes before the main verb. And then if you're using it in a presentation, you'll use it when you're making your very final or last points. Okay, we've got two expressions to go, lastly and by the end. So let's look at lastly. So finally and lastly almost have identical meanings. So if you are getting a little bit fed up, or you don't want to use finally all the time, well then by all means you can use lastly. But just take note of the fact that lastly is a little bit more formal than finally. Finally is a little bit more used in informal and spoken English, okay? But we do use lastly. Let me give you an example. When somebody is reading out a really long list of items, let's say at an auction, somebody's reading out the contents of a house that are for auction, that are for sale. He'll start with one room and then go on to the next room, and then he says, okay, finally I've come to the bedroom, and he starts listing down the items, the paintings on the wall, the lamps, the cupboards, and lastly this chest of drawers that's been in the family for many, many years. Okay, so here is when we use lastly, the long list of items. Okay, the last expression, by the end, and by the end means there's some limit. Okay, so when you're getting to the end of something, for example, by the end of the week all his work had been done. By the end of the month there was nothing left for him to do. Okay, by the end of the day he was really tired. So just getting to the end doesn't mean at the very last minute. It could be the last couple of days, the last couple of minutes, the last couple of hours. Okay, by the end of the presentation everybody was bored and had fallen asleep. Yeah, that often happens. You have to be very careful. You have to keep people interested and tell them lots of stories. So by the end of the presentation you want them to want more. Okay, so there we are. We're at the end of the video and at the end of this little presentation. In the beginning of it I told you what we were going to look at and explained to you what we were talking about in terms of these different expressions. So by the end of the video I expect that you will understand what they mean and how to use them. Okay, so remember to subscribe to my channel, press the button there and you'll be able to get the link, and join me on www.englishlessonviaskype.com, and when you get there look out for the link to the Easy Peasy English Club. Okay, this is a really great club for helping you to improve all aspects of your English, your spoken English, your written English, and also your grammar. Okay, join me again soon.